Did you go out to the field often with the Australian Army?
No, not very often. Certainly not as much as some of the other correspondents like Don Simmons, Pat Burgess and so on. A variety of reasons. I went more with the Americans, I suppose, than I did with the Australians.
Simply because you didn't get a good reception from the Australian Army, or why?
Well, in a sense that was partly true, although I tended to feel that the Australians, in a cold-blooded sort of way, weren't involved in too much that was strategically important.
And did they give you much cooperation at all, or make you feel that...
Oh, no, I always felt a certain hostility from the Australian Army. That didn't have much to do, well, it didn't have all that to do, I suppose, with the fact that I didn't work that much with them, but they weren't the most cooperative Army people or group of official individuals I've ever worked with, certainly not compared with Americans or British Army people.
Do you think the ABC television covered the war adequately?
Given the television standards of that time, I think it was probably fair enough. By today's standards, I don't think it was comprehensive enough. Part of the trouble was cost, of course, of using cameras, of getting cameras there. And if, I suppose, you could be critical that there wasn't enough visual material coming out from the ABC correspondents, but as I say, that was governed largely by cost.
Cut. 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 What was one of the more frightening experiences you had while you were over there?
Well, frightening, perhaps not frightening as much as, in a sense, comical, I suppose. I was out with the Junk Force, which is a group of people that used to patrol the coast of Vietnam, trying to intercept the arms traffic coming in for the Viet Cong forces. I was with a young American reservist. We were cruising up past what the Americans called a free fire zone. In other words, you could fire anything that moved or even wasn't moving if you liked. He offered me a shot with his carbine. I fired off a few rounds and was admiring it. Next minute, the fire suddenly was returned, to our great shock and surprise, and we didn't have much cover. We just had a little wooden structure on the junk, and this Viet Cong was peppering the tripe out of us. He busted a water line. The boat was drifting towards shore. We were pretty helpless. What had happened, presumably, was that he'd had a long night marauding some village and was having a quiet sleep. We came along and destroyed his sleep.
Slumber.
Yeah. Anyway, we finally came to terms because the American pulled out a new gizmo that he'd had with him, a plastic rocket launcher type thing, or grenade launcher. He didn't know how to use it properly. He was sort of half reading the booklet and firing the trigger at the same time, but it fell far short into the water, but caused...
Yeah, good.
This Viet Cong gentleman, whose sleep had obviously been disturbed by us, was obviously impressed by this rocket grenade or grenade launcher thing because it caused a great explosion in the water. Missed him by a mile. But anyway, my American friend loosed off another one, and that seemed to be the end of it. We didn't hear any more from the shore, so we had time to repair things and go for our lives, you know. But that's, you know, one of those mad things that could happen to you quite innocently.
You were involved in the 1968 Tet Offensive too. You were one of the first journalists to get a report to the outside world. How did you first hear about Tet? Once again,
comical almost situation. The phones in Saigon never worked properly. You never used them because they were pretty hopeless. But early on the morning of Tet, the phone rang in my hotel room, and it was Pat Burgess, who was staying about 4 or 5 blocks down on the Saigon River from where I was in central Saigon. And Pat said, mate, there's something on. And I said, for God's sake, you know, this hour of the morning, Pat, fancy bring me to say that. Next minute the phone went dead and I could hear it thumping on the floor, and I looked through the French doors of my room, and which had a clear view to the river, and saw this tracer bouncing off Pat's hotel. And a minute or so later, Pat came to grabbed the phone again and gasping, and said, Christ, they're shooting through the window. It was obvious then that things were afoot. And
this was the start of Tet?
Yep, right.
So what
they were doing was attacking the naval headquarters just down the road from where Pat was, yeah.
So did you go back to sleep and say, right?
Well, we talked about it. Then we could hear sirens, great activity in the streets, military, police. Were always trigger happy anyway after dark. We thought the best thing to do, or the most sensible thing to do, was to wait till first light, which we did. At first light, I headed up the street towards the Reuter office where we filed our copy. I was confronted by a large Australian military policeman, of all things, and that was an unusual sight in Saigon. This big fellow was standing there with a big pistol in his hand, firing shots in the air for some reason. He seemed to have lost control of himself and the situation he was in.
Of course, this is obviously the first time that the Viet Cong had shown they were capable of launching assault right into the heart of what was their enemy.
Sure. And of course what was really happening, that I wasn't aware at that point, was that just around the corner from him was the American embassy, where a Viet Cong sapper group had blown a hole in the wall, killed the guards, and had been for some time trying to blow the door of the embassy. The idea being to take control of the embassy and then symbolically, by doing that, take control of Saigon.
General Westmoreland held a press conference later that afternoon.
Well, no, the Americans actually cleared the compound by about, from memory, 8 or 9 in the morning by simply throwing grenades over the wall. The Viet Cong were entrapped and they were just sort of sitting ducks. At the very moment that the embassy was regarded as secure again, the gates were flung open. Westmoreland, who'd been waiting around the corner, came screaming around with a convoy of military police and sirens and so on. Like all generals, he had a gimmick. His gimmick was to wear a World War II paratrooper's uniform that was always immaculately starched. He strode into the forecourt of the embassy, the most incongruous sight. There were bodies of dead Viet Cong all over the forecourt. And he held this impromptu press conference where with great vigour he talked about pursuing the enemy. It was the greatest mistake the Viet Cong had made in the war. They'd exposed themselves. At this point, an MP down the 20-30 yards away from us was triggering booby traps on these dead Viet Cong. He obviously set off a grenade charge that one of them was carrying. Poor old Westie's whole mood and delivery was destroyed by the fact that he jumped about 3 feet in the air. I think I jumped about 4 feet with him.
Can we just cut on that point? Cut. We've got a lot of noise. Can you just recount for me that incident where the Viet Cong was creeping up the steps?
Yes, what had happened while the battle for the embassy was on inside the compound, one of the badly wounded Viet Cong had made his way to one of the houses in the compound. It was occupied by an American military attaché. He was a colonel, I think. He was in his bed upstairs. This wounded Viet Cong he could hear crawling up the steps. The colonel was unarmed. Fortunately, as he waited virtually to have his head shot off by this Viet Cong, the Americans forced their way into the compound, and one American soldier called out to him and threw a pistol to him from the ground. In fact, I think he missed the first time, which made it
more harrowing.
More harrowing indeed, yes. Finally he caught it. The Viet Cong's head appeared above the stairway, and he was able to shoot him and survive.
You were one of the first European Western newsmen to get into Cambodia, and you got an exclusive interview with Wilfrid Burchett. Can you tell me about that?
Well, we weren't the first, I suppose. That's an exaggeration I may have misled you, but certainly we got in at a time when Western journalists weren't allowed in. There had been a long-standing ban because Prince Sihanouk had been upset with some reporting by Western pressmen. But we cabled the Prince and asked whether we could come, and he said yes, and in we went.
Much to your surprise.
Totally to our surprise. Wilfrid Burchett used to spend a fair bit of time there. He was, of course, then a legendary figure. One of the difficulties about Vietnam reporting the war was to try and assess to what extent the information you got in Saigon was really factual, because you didn't have any other way of finding out what was going on behind the lines. Burchett was one man who did know, because he'd been into Vietnam with the Viet Cong and for lengthy periods of time. Lo and behold, on the first day I was in Phnom Penh, I saw Burchett walking down the street. We filmed an interview with him. He described in a fair bit of detail what it was like in the Viet Cong held areas of Saigon, of Vietnam. He was interesting because he was able to tell us that the Viet Cong, the National Liberation Front, did control very big areas of the country, which of course was totally at odds with the story in Saigon that the pacification was widespread and so on. He was interesting too, though, in a personal way, because he was then a man, I think, of about 52. He used to don black pyjamas, wear a bamboo hat, and he wandered through the South Vietnam. Now, obviously, at great personal risk. He had narrow escapes he told us about. It was an interesting personal story, as I say, as well as being an interesting political sidelight. That film, unfortunately, was ordered to be destroyed by the ABC in Sydney.
How did that happen?
All I knew, and I didn't know until later, much later, weeks later in fact, was that I, in the usual way, sent a cable to Singapore, which then sent to Sydney a cable saying we had an interview with Wilfrid Burchett on flight so-and-so. As soon as that was received in Sydney, instructions came from management, which part of management I'm not sure, whether it was the news department or higher management in the ABC, that the interview was not to be used, in fact was to be destroyed. And it was destroyed, I understand, under supervision.
Did the commissioners of the ABC ever know about that?
They wouldn't have been aware of it, I don't think.
That was rather irresponsible action on the part to do that. Did that happen often?
But it was probably the worst instance, I recall, and it seemed to me to be pointless because it was quite a valid thing to do, to have interviewed a man like Burchett as he was at that time.
Must have been totally disappointing for you, having gone to all that trouble and got a really good story on film to have it.
Oh, naturally I was furious when I heard about it.
And nothing you can do about it?
Nothing, not a thing, not a thing.
Okay. Can you tell me what the American network's attitude was towards hiring Australian cameramen and journalists?
Well, they were always ready with big money offers. My view, I was, in a sense, just an observer. You'd have to ask the cameramen involved themselves, but it was always my feeling that Australians got hired largely as cannon fodder, because they were non-American. If a mishap occurred, it was less messy, if you like, for an American network.
The Australians were, what, more willing to go out into the field and get the action?
Well, I think a lot of American staff cameramen from, you know, regular NBC, ABC, CBS cameramen really were jibbing a bit. And no one would blame them, because the American networks demanded continually action. That's all they really wanted. You know, they had to see shot and shell every day of the week. And I think quite a few of these Americans, as I say, I don't criticise them for it, jacked up.
What sort of character was Don Simmons?
Don was very much a man who believed in seeing at first hand action, and just how the troops were confronting and being confronted by the situation that existed in the Australian area.
And Neil Davis?
Neil Davis was of the same mould, except Neil's brief was a bit wider, and he ultimately became probably the film specialist on the coverage of the war from the Vietnamese point of view.
Totally fearless?
I would say so, in the most underplayed way. He's not a gung-ho man, but a mild-mannered, quite fearless individual.
Okay. Good one.
The sun starting to come around there.
Yeah, it was under his face, I noticed that.
What's one can do about it?